The Russian Civil War is often viewed as a conflict between whites and reds, between Bolsheviks and monarchists. And while this isn't false, it's a bit of an oversimplification. The truth is that when such a vast empire like Russia collapses, there are bound to be a myriad of different factions, all fighting for their own goals. The lines between combatants were first drawn before the Civil War even started, in the form of political parties. The most important of these was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Initially a united organization, it soon split up after the party's Second Congress in 1903 between Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov, and Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Both groups believed in very similar things, but there were obviously some key differences. Firstly, the Mensheviks were more moderate, more willing to work alongside non-Marxists till the time came for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were less patient and more authoritarian. Secondly, it was the figure of Lenin. The Bolsheviks didn't necessarily follow a certain ideology, but more so the figure of Lenin himself. There's a reason why Lenin had his own cult of personality later in life. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, many Mensheviks simply submitted to the new regime, but many more eventually formed opposition governments in places like Georgia and Siberia, even allying themselves with the whites, though it ultimately didn't work out for them. The second most important party was the Socialist Revolutionaries. Unlike the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, whom had the support of the European proletariat, the Socialist Revolutionaries was a rural-oriented party, getting most of their support from the peasantry. Just like the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, their own party was also divided into two separate wings, a right wing, which was their equivalent to the Mensheviks, and a left wing led by Maria Spiridonova. The left SSRs collaborated extensively with the Bolsheviks, even being recruited into the infamous Cheka. However, this came round to bite Lenin in the ass. In mid-1918, two SRs in the Cheka assassinated the German ambassador, Count Mirbach. Soon afterwards, Maria Spiridonova staged an uprising in Moscow that came close to toppling Lenin's regime, but ultimately she failed. Spiridonova and other left SR leaders were soon incarcerated, and many more were executed. Those who remained either continued to fight for the Bolsheviks or joined the white movement against them. The third most important was the Constitutional Democratic Party led by Pavel Milyukov. The members of the KPD ranged between progressive liberals and constitutional monarchists. They tried their best to reform Russia from within the confines of the law, but never had the power to truly challenge the authority of the Tsar. After the February Revolution, the KPD basically controlled the provisional government for a brief period of time. After the October Revolution, what was left of them joined the white movement and tried to form somewhat democratic governments along with the Mensheviks and the SRs of the right. Though not very large, the Black Hundreds made their presence known. The Black Hundreds were a far-right monarchist group that became infamous for their anti-Semitism and pogroms. They also received funding from the Tsar's government, and Nicholas often wrote fondly of them in his diary. Moving on to the Civil War itself, the earliest military formations that partook in it were the Red Guards, formed during the February Revolution. The Red Guards were worker militias affiliated with their respective places of work. Unlike a proper army, they were decentralized, operating independently, though they did take a liking to the Bolsheviks. As far as combat effectiveness goes, they performed quite poorly due to a lack of training and discipline. During the early days of the Bolshevik regime, Lenin relied extensively on a select few military formations to hold things together. The most trusted of these were the Latvian riflemen. Not only did they act as Lenin's personal bodyguards, but also played a pivotal role in subduing the previously mentioned SR uprising in Moscow, as well as holding back the Czechoslovak Legion when they revolted. The Baltic Fleet sailors, specifically those from the island fortress of Kronstadt, were also trusted Bolshevik allies, helping them seize power and fighting many of the Civil War's first battles. Many of them were of anarchist tendencies, yet still fought for the Bolsheviks. They were so loved that they were called the heroes of the revolution. But after the Civil War ended, the sailors of Kronstadt came to the shocking revelation that by fighting for the authoritarian Bolsheviks, they ended up forming an authoritarian government. Believing that what the Bolsheviks were doing wasn't real communism, they revolted but were ultimately crushed. Needing a proper fighting force to beat back the whites, prominent Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky established the Red Army. Initially, it wasn't much better than the Red Guards, but soon afterwards they began recruiting former Tsarist officers as military experts to help with its organization and leadership. On the other side of the coin, we have the White Armies. Unlike the Red Army, the White Armies were not a single entity but several different militias all fighting against the Bolsheviks. A common misconception is that they were all monarchists. While this is true for many of their prominent leaders, there were, as mentioned, many socialists and liberals who fought alongside them, though this was largely because they had no other alternative. Starting in the south, there was the Armed Forces of South Russia. Initially, it was led by Lev Kornilov, but after his untimely death, command was handed over to Anton Denikin and later to Peter Wrangel after Denikin's resignation. At first, it was just the volunteer army, founded by Tsarist officers such as the previously mentioned Kornilov, and was later joined by the Cossacks of the Don and the Kuban. The Cossacks had their own peculiarities. Firstly, many Cossacks viewed themselves as distinct from the rest of Russia, and at times were hesitant to fight outside of their respective republics. The Don Republic became the de facto state in the area. They stayed out of the civil war for a brief period of time, but were quickly dragged into it once the Bolsheviks began attacking Cossacks all over the Don. The Cossacks of the Kuban took things a few steps further. For a brief period, the Kuban People's Republic formed part of Ukraine under German rule. But soon after, Germany took a huge L, and the Kuban was occupied by the White Army who, more or less, coerced them into joining their cause. So, the armed forces of southern Russia was made up of the previously mentioned volunteer army, the Don Army, commanded by Vladimir Sidorin, and the Caucasus Army, commanded by Peter Wrangel. After the October Revolution, Siberia became home to several different governments made up of Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and cadets. Firstly, there was a government based in Samara called the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, or Komuch for short. They even had their own military called the People's Army that fought against the Bolsheviks around the Urals. There were then two other provisional governments, one in the far eastern city of Vladivostok and the second in the Siberian city of Omsk. These three groups would unite and form the short-lived All-Russian Provisional Government until it was overthrown in a coup by Admiral Kolchak, supported by the British. Kolchak's short reign was marked by extensive corruption, incompetence, and brutality that only served to strain relations between him and his foreign allies. After he was detained by the Czechoslovaks, Kolchak handed over control of the Siberian army to the Cossack warlord Grigory Semyonov and named Anton Denikin as the new ruler of White Russia. At the late stages of the Civil War, the short-lived Far Eastern Republic was proclaimed between Lake Baikal and the Pacific Ocean. Initially a Bolshevik ally against the Japanese, it was soon brought back into the rest of Russia. Aside from these governments, there were also several semi-independent warlords and Cossack hosts in the area. The previously mentioned Grigory Semyonov had his own little fiefdom called Eastern Ukraina, not to be confused with Green Ukraine, and was supported by Japan. After Kolchak's capture and execution, he was unable to control the remaining white forces in Siberia. Collapsing into anarchy, the White Russians of Siberia died a slow, agonizing death. Further west, there was the Cossack horde of Orenburg of the Eurasian steppe. They fought against the Bolsheviks, though it didn't go particularly well as they were pushed out of their homes and forced into exile in China. By far the most interesting of these warlords was a fella named Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. This drug-addicted psychopath believed himself to be a descendant of Genghis Khan and set out with a small army to conquer Mongolia and proclaimed himself their new warlord. Now, since Lenin was lame and gay, he put an end to Sternberg's antics and had the guy executed. In the northern city of Murmansk, the local Soviet had invited Allied forces in to prevent the city's vast stockpiles of war materials from falling into the hands of the Germans and their Finnish allies. Soon after, a second Allied landing was conducted in Arkhangelsk, and a provisional government of the northern region was established by the veteran Social Democrat Nikolai Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was briefly overthrown by the Tsarist officer Grigory Chaplin, but this coup was condemned by the interventionists, and Tchaikovsky was soon brought back into power. Eventually, control of the government was handed over to Yevgeny Miller. By that time, the situation had started to deteriorate. The Allies helped form a White Russian army commanded by General Marushevsky. It was pretty much a failure as they were incapable of recruiting enough soldiers, and many of those who did join ended up deserting. Once the Allies had withdrawn, the White movement in the north was soon defeated by the Bolsheviks. The regional government of northwestern Russia had begun to take shape under German occupation. The White Russians in the area fought alongside the Estonians, and later, General Nikolai Yudenich formed the Northwestern Army that had a short and almost game-changing role in the Civil War. In mid-1919, Yudenich launched an offensive towards Petrograd, but ultimately failed to capture the city, being pushed back by the Bolsheviks and later disarmed by the Estonians. Trapped in between the Whites and the Reds were several other factions that weren't really allied to anyone. The Green armies were independent and disorganized peasant militias that operated on a local level against the Whites and the Bolsheviks. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks temporarily pacified the peasants by giving them land, but as they began to requisition grain by force, the peasants started to arm themselves to defend their villages. During the Civil War, there were hundreds of peasant revolts all over Russia, notably at the end of the war in Tambov and western Siberia. In southern Ukraine operated the Ukrainian Black Army, commanded by Nestor Makhno. It was an anarchist movement that fought against the Bolsheviks and the Whites. During Denikin's Moscow offensive, the Blacks waged havoc in his rear, contributing to his failure. For a moment, the Black Army formed an alliance with the Bolsheviks to defeat the White Army once and for all, taking part in the final offensive into Crimea. Once the Whites were defeated, the Black Army and Red Army resumed hostilities. Unsurprisingly, the Black Army was defeated and Nestor Makhno was forced into exile. Unlike the Whites, Reds, and Ukrainians, the Black Army was far less anti-Semitic, though there was occasional violence against Jews. Instead, the Black Army preferred to target Germans as revenge for their occupation and because they associated them with the bourgeois. Last but not least was the Czechoslovak Legion. Formed of Czechoslovak emigres and POWs, the Legion fought alongside the Allies, hoping to liberate their country from the Austro-Hungarians. After Bolshevik Russia withdrew from the war, they traveled across the Trans-Siberian Railway towards Vladivostok with the intent on leaving Russia for some other front of the war. After hostilities broke out between them and the Bolsheviks, they seized control of the Trans-Siberian Railway as well as many other key cities in Siberia. They were then pressured by the Allies into helming Kolchak. Despite doing so, they very much disliked the White Russians and vice versa. After hearing word that Kolchak was going to block them off from retreating, they took him as their prisoner before handing him over to the Bolsheviks. The Czechoslovak Legion then did the smart thing and got the hell out of Russia.
This is bullcrap. I am not following this stupid hippie around anymore.
Eric, where are you going?
I'm going this way.
Young man, I am the adult here and I say you go this way.
Look, you can stay over nah, but I'm going over nah.
Young man, I have had it.
No. You nah, me nah. Screw you guys. I'm going home.
While they very much despised the Bolsheviks and wanted them gone, the Allied powers were first and foremost preoccupied with defeating Germany. As mentioned, they were invited into Murmansk to prevent the Germans from capturing stockpiles of weapons. Intervention in Russia was justified within the context of World War I, wanting to reopen the Eastern Front to weaken the Central Powers. When the Czechoslovak Legion revolted, they used that as an excuse for further intervention, claiming that they were just trying to rescue them from Vladivostok. When the war against the Central Powers concluded, the Allies lacked the political capital to support the war in Russia and eventually withdrew. Britain was by far the most committed to overthrowing the Bolsheviks, and men such as Winston Churchill lobbied hard to increase support for the White Movement. The Americans followed closely, though many of their prominent leaders, such as General Graves, were skeptical of the affair. Though technically allies, the Japanese pretty much acted on their own accord, with the intent on expanding their influence into Siberia. Colonial troops from Britain also took part in the intervention, including, but not limited to, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, and Nepal. France was also involved, though their experience was arguably the worst. Minor allied nations such as Serbia, Greece, and Romania also fought on Russian soil. Around Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the interventionists were heavily involved in fighting against the Bolsheviks. In Vladivostok, on the other hand, they showed much more restraint, operating behind the front lines and focusing on defending the railways. General Knox, commander of the British forces in Vladivostok, wanted to increase aid for the Whites and was also a strong supporter of Kolchak. General Graves, the American commander, was the polar opposite, very much disliking Kolchak's brutal regime and wanting to leave Russia as soon as possible. After Germany's defeat, the French and the Greeks occupied key coastal cities in southern Ukraine, such as Odessa. However, the French were forced to withdraw after a series of mutinies took place on their warships that had to be put down by the Greeks. During Denikin's offensive into Ukraine and towards Moscow, the British Royal Air Force provided much-needed air support for the White Army. When the Bolsheviks struck back, the British Royal Navy provided a critical role in evacuating the Whites from the Caucasus and later from Crimea into exile. Early on in the Civil War, the British sent a multinational expedition led by General Dunsterville called the Dunster Force to secure the oil fields of Baku against the advancing Ottoman army. Once in Baku, Dunster Force and their local allies fought a three-way battle against both the Red Army and the Turks. They ultimately failed and were driven out by the Ottomans. Luckily though, the Great War came to an end and they established friendly relations with the new Azerbaijani government. Around the same time, just across the Caspian Sea, a second expedition called Norpur Force traveled to Central Asia to assist the White forces against the Bolsheviks in Turkestan. Initially successful, they were eventually defeated and withdrew from the area. With the main armies out of the way, it's time to move on to the minor factions of the Civil War, i.e. those of smaller nations and lesser-known insurgencies. The case of Finland was quite interesting due to the simple fact that their Declaration of Independence was immediately recognized by the Bolsheviks, while those of other nations had to fight full-scale wars against them for their freedom. The reason for this was that the Bolsheviks believed that the Finnish Soviets would inevitably win the Civil War and bring Finland back into the fold. Finland was divided between the Reds, who controlled the largest cities in the south, and the Whites, made up of liberals, conservatives, monarchists, and Swedish nationalists, who controlled the rural north. The Finnish White Army was supported by regulars from the German army and Swedish paramilitary sent by their respective governments. They also received volunteers from places such as Poland, Denmark, and Estonia. The Finnish Red Army also received foreign support, this time from the Bolsheviks, in the form of military aid. There were also thousands of Russian soldiers stationed in Finland, but most of them went home, leaving only a few to join the Finnish Red Army. Thanks to foreign support and better leadership, the Finnish White Army defeated the Reds in the short but bloody Finnish Civil War. To the east of Finland lies the region of Karelia. The Karelians are, in many ways, like the Finns, but also have their own distinct identity. Interestingly, when the British landed in Murmansk, hundreds of Karelians joined them and fought against the Finnish White Army. The Karelians hoped to achieve greater autonomy and even independence, but the White Russians were unwilling to cede to their demands, and the Karelian troops were either disarmed or deserted. Eventually, they formed their own state called the Republic of Utwa. The White Finnish government reconciled with the Karelians and sent troops and aid to support them. But as you could probably guess, the Bolsheviks put an end to the short-lived Karelian Republic, though an insurgency fought against the Soviets for a few more years. The Ingrians are a minority group with close ties to the Finns, inhabiting parts of northern Estonia, southern Finland, and around the Russian city of Petrograd. Like many others, they formed their own state just north of Petrograd and basically became a Finnish satellite state. Tragically for them, the whole republic was swallowed up by the Bolsheviks and many of its people fled to Finland. The Baltic states were forced to fight multiple enemies from all sides, even from within. Firstly, the Bolsheviks set up rival governments to challenge their nationalist movements. After the Germans occupied the Baltics, they established the United Baltic Duchy. After the defeat in World War I, the duchy was supposed to hand over control to the newly established Estonian and Latvian governments. However, rogue German soldiers and the local German population of Latvia refused and fought a war against the Estonians and the Latvians. They formed their own army called the Baltisch Landwehr and were aided by a Freikorps unit called the Iron Division. Initially allies, they briefly seized most of Latvia, but were then pushed back by a combined force of Estonians and Latvians. What remained of the Landwehr and the Iron Division were then put under British command and later repatriated back to Germany. Made up of released Russian POWs and rogue Freikorps soldiers dressed in Russian uniforms, the West Russian Volunteer Army, led by Pavel Bermont-Avalov, fought a brief war against Estonia and Latvia. But by fighting against various anti-Bolshevik armies, they were declared to be very cringe and were disowned by the rest of the White movement. Once defeated, the remains of the West Russian Volunteer Army retreated into Lithuania, fighting a brief war against them till the latter achieved victory. Estonia is what I like to call the Giga Chad of the Baltics. Commies and krauts threatening your borders? Well, no need to fear, because Estonia is here. Estonia fought against the Reds, Whites, and Germans and came out on top every single time. It's for this reason that I have given Estonia the title of God's third favorite country. Their most famous endeavor was their offensive towards Petrograd that caught the Bolsheviks by surprise. Little Estonia came so close to conquering the Russian capital, but the Germans, like they always do, had to ruin it for everyone. As mentioned, the United Baltic Duchy went to war with Estonia, attacking them during the Petrograd offensive and forcing them to divert troops to the south. Ultimately, Estonia won their War of Independence. Latvia's independence was by far the most hard-fought out of the three Baltic states. Firstly, the population of Latvia was much more radicalized and divided. The Red Latvian riflemen led the charge in a Bolshevik offensive to retake the country. The German military in the area initially fought alongside the Latvians against the Reds, but later betrayed them. With help from Estonia and the British, Latvia defeated the rogue German units and reclaimed their country. As mentioned, they also had to contend with the West Russian Volunteer Army, to which they also defeated. While Latvia was reliant on external help to win their War of Independence, that doesn't take away from the fact that they fought incredibly hard and against all odds, ultimately won. Just like the rest of the Baltic states, Lithuania had to contend with a rival government set up by the Soviets. Interestingly, German paramilitaries also fought alongside the Lithuanians against the Bolsheviks, but ultimately remained faithful to their alliance, eventually peacefully withdrawing back to Germany. Less faithful were the Poles, whom had border disputes with the Lithuanians regarding the areas around the city of Vilnius. At first, they fought alongside each other against the Bolsheviks, but things turned sour when the Poles refused to withdraw from Lithuanian-claimed territory. Despite that, the Lithuanians sent soldiers to assist Poland during the Polish-Soviet War. Vilnius was briefly reclaimed by Lithuania until a Polish-sponsored mutiny took it away from them. Belarus had, perhaps, one of the most unfortunate attempts at independence when compared to the other minorities of the Russian Empire. There existed a brief nationalist government before the Bolsheviks crushed it. Their most notable endeavor was forming a military unit called the Lithuanian Belarusian Infantry Division that fought alongside the Poles in their war against the Soviets. This mixed division also took part in the previously mentioned Polish Spontan Mutiny in Vilnius. After the Poles withdrew from occupied Belarus as part of their peace deal with the Bolsheviks, there was a futile attempt by the Belarusian nationalists to fight the Bolsheviks. But like so many others, their dream of independence was crushed. When Poland finally regained her independence after well over 100 years, she was filled with ambition to reclaim the former territories of the extinct Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a task made rather difficult due to the multi-ethnic composure of these territories and the desires of other states. Under the leadership of Joseph Pilsudski, Poland fought wars with almost all of its neighbors. Polish insurgents rose up in Germany, a brief conflict was fought against Czechoslovakia, a Ukrainian state was destroyed, and most famously, a massive war was waged against the Bolsheviks that almost resulted in Polish defeat had it not been for a decisive battle that is often called the Miracle of the Vistula. Unlike other minor players of the Russian Civil War, Poland enjoyed vast amount of foreign support from the Allies, particularly from France. For this reason, Poland emerged out of the ruins of the Russian Empire as the largest and strongest state in Eastern Europe aside from the USSR. Ukraine's situation was in many ways similar to that of Poland, except they lacked the same foreign support. Ukraine was surrounded by three main armies, the Poles to the west, the Whites to the south, and the Reds to the north. After the February Revolution, the Ukrainian Rada, headed by Mikhailo Hrushevsky, became the de facto government of the country. After the October Revolution, Ukraine proclaimed her independence and fought their first war against the Bolsheviks. With their armies being pushed back on all fronts, the Ukrainian Rada signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers, becoming a German protectorate. The Rada was then overthrown in a German-backed coup led by Pavlo Skoropadsky. Skoropadsky tried to form an alliance with the Volunteer Army, but the Russians refused to accept Ukraine's right to self-determination. When the Germans were defeated and withdrew from Ukraine, the Rada was reinstated and war with the Bolsheviks resumed. The Ukrainian army was a rather pitiful fighting force made up of militiamen, tired World War I veterans, and students. Though they did have a few capable units, two of those being the Bluecoat Division formed by the Germans and the Sich Rifleman Unit formed by the Austro-Hungarians. The Bolsheviks once again pushed the Ukrainians back. Kiev fell to the Reds, and the remnants of the Rada sought refuge in the center-west part of the country. Some Ukrainian units even joined the White Army, though others continued to fight them. When Denikin launched his own invasion of Bolshevik-held Ukraine, he was unwilling to make any sort of compromise with them. The remainder of the Rada was then overthrown by Simon Petliura, whom formed an alliance with Poland against the Bolsheviks. It should also be pointed out that during this time, Ukrainian forces committed a series of pogroms that claimed the lives of thousands, while a general sense of lawlessness plagued the rear. This can largely be explained by the lack of discipline of the Ukrainian army, and by the Rada's inability to establish law and order. Tragically for the Ukrainians, their dreams of independence were crushed, and they'd have to wait several more decades for it. Instead of being under a single government, the western part of Ukraine was briefly its own state, made up of the former territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrians stimulated Ukrainian nationalism to act as a counterweight to the Poles, and many Ukrainians participated in local government. When the West Ukrainian People's Republic proclaimed independence, they had much more experience in government, which resulted in better internal stability when compared to the Ukrainian Rada. The West Ukrainian army even had a Jewish regiment, and pogroms were far less common. Despite having signed the Unification Act with the Ukrainian People's Republic, West Ukraine was by all means a separate state. Aside from the War of Poland that resulted in the complete occupation of West Ukraine, the Westerners also fought border skirmishes with Czechoslovakia and the Romanians. Romania joined World War I on the side of the Allies, but was almost completely occupied by the Central Powers. What was left of the Romanian army fled towards the Russian border region of Bessarabia, inhabited predominantly by ethnic Romanians. During the Russian Revolution, Bessarabia separated from the rest of Russia and was united with Romania. The Romanians were not only forced to fight the Central Powers, but both the Red and White armies. The glorious nation of Romania ultimately beat all three of them and greatly expanded their own borders. This wouldn't be the end of it, however, as the Hungarian Communist government, aided by the Bolsheviks, launched an invasion of Romania. In an ironic twist of fate, the Romanians counterattacked and ended up occupying most of Hungary and annexing a sizable chunk of its territory, more than doubling the size of Romania. Once again, glorious Romania came out on top. For a brief period of time, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan united under a single country called the Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, independent from Bolshevik and White Russia. The purpose behind this was to unite against the advancing Ottomans, but the Federative Republic broke up over disagreements between the three nations. What makes the Caucasus theater of the Russian Civil War rather interesting is that some of the conflicts waged during this period are technically still ongoing. Being both Turkish and Muslim, the Azerbaijanis quickly allied themselves with the Ottomans soon after the collapse of the Russian Empire. Azeri, Ottoman, and other Muslims went on to form the Islamic Army of the Caucasus, advancing towards the oil-rich city of Baku. Meanwhile in Baku, and the rest of Azerbaijan, the Bolsheviks, with help from local Armenians, seized control of the area, massacring many Azeri civilians in the process, establishing the so-called Baku Commune. In a twist of fate, the Armenians betrayed the Bolsheviks and along with White Russians, staged a revolt in Baku, pushing out the Reds. They then established the Central Caspian dictatorship and invited the aforementioned Dunster force into the city to help defend it against the Turks. Unfortunately for them, the Ottomans and the Azeris conquered the city and conducted their own reprisals against the Armenians. Azerbaijan retained its independence after the Ottoman Empire collapsed, even establishing friendly relations with the British. As expected, Azerbaijan was eventually conquered by the Soviets. After gaining its independence, Georgia became a German protectorate and a German mission was sent to the country. The Georgians fought a brief civil war against the South Ossetians that they ultimately won. Other than that, and the skirmishes between them and the Armenians, Georgia enjoyed a brief period of peace until the Bolsheviks attacked. What soldiers weren't captured or killed fled to the mountains, waging a guerrilla war for several years against the Soviets. The Armenians had a strong sense of national identity. When the Russian army collapsed and the Ottomans advanced, Armenian units continued to hold the line. Unlike Georgia and Azerbaijan, Armenia was on the side of the Allies, meaning that they benefited the most when the war ended. There were some skirmishes between Armenians and Georgians along their disputed border, but other than that, the Armenian state tried to avoid conflict. Despite that, a rogue Armenian paramilitary unit set out to the region of Nagorno-Karabakh and fought a war against Azerbaijan. When the Bolsheviks finally had the time to deal with them, they signed a deal with the new Turkish Republic to invade and divide up Armenian territory. Just like in the Baltics and the Caucasus, Central Asia was home to several new states after the fall of the Russian Empire, three of them being the Khanate of Khiva, the Emirate of Bukhara, and the Alash Autonomy. These three tended to stick to the sidelines of the civil war, not really getting involved with either the Whites or the Reds. Because of this, they were left politically isolated, and no one came to their rescue when the Bolsheviks invaded them. The civil war in Central Asia was waged between the Turkestan Socialist Federative Republic, established by the Bolsheviks, and the Trans-Caspian government, supported by the British. With help from Norpur Force, the Turkestan government was able to push back the Bolsheviks, but as time went on, the Bolsheviks began to receive more aid from Moscow and turned the tide of the civil war. By far the most interesting group in this area were the Basmachis. They had initially revolted against the Tsar in 1916 before being mostly crushed. The power vacuum created by the collapse of the Russian Empire allowed them to regroup and rearm, seizing control of territory on the Afghan border. Surprisingly, the Bolsheviks hired Enver Pacha, the former chief of the General Staff of the Ottoman Empire and one of the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, as a military advisor in hopes that his prestige would convince people not to join the Basmachis. Instead, Pacha defected to the Muslim rebels and fought against his former employers. In an ironic twist of fate, Pacha was hunted down and killed by a patrol of Armenian cavalrymen in Bolshevik service. He may have killed millions of them, but at least the Armenians got the last laugh. The Basmachis continued to fight the Soviets well into the 1930s, but were ultimately crushed, just like so many others. The Russian Civil War, or wars, was made rather complicated simply due to how many different factions fought in them. Hopefully, this video has explained who was fighting and whom they were fighting. If you want to support the channel, then you can consider subscribing. I also have a Ko-fi page where you can donate if you'd like. Thanks for watching, and till next time.
You like that? Huh? You like that? You just tune this out, don't you? Well, tune this out!